see a light come up saying we're recording.
Okay.
Cool. All right. I'm going to go away. All right. So, David, thanks again for doing this. Oh, and before I forget, let me put in. I'm going to change your name slightly because your name will appear when you're talking. Okay. Cool. All right. So, David, how did you discover Star Trek and what inspired you about it?
I wasn't expecting that question. Give me a second. How did you discover Star Trek and what inspired you about it? I first started watching Star Trek when I was a kid in the 1970s. It was on every day in the afternoons, and my brother and my dad would watch it in the evenings on dinner time. And I think for us, it was a show that was not like anything else on television. It had a certain unique quality to it that looked at the future, not just the past. And my dad grew up on cowboys, and everything was always about the Old West, and Star Trek was sort of the Old West, but different. It had something a little bit added on to that. And later on, I think it became kind of a tradition for us that we liked the values and the characters of the show, and so we continued watching on until the later iterations of it.
That's cool. How did you get involved working on the Star Trek comics?
Well, how did you get involved working on the Star Trek comics? Chris Ryle at IDW Publishing brought my brother and I into Star Trek comics around 2007 or so. Scott and Chris had known each other for quite a while. They both worked on one of Kevin Smith's websites, actually. And Chris knew that Scott and I knew Star Trek really well. And Chris knew that we would have a good handle on how to write Star Trek comics. And so we started off doing some of the Alien Spotlight comics. And then we segued into some longer series. We worked on one called Intelligence Gathering. That was our first Next Gen comic. We also worked on, later on, we worked on, hold on a sec. Okay. And then later on, we worked on some other series. We did more recently the Q Conflict, but we've done a lot of Star Trek comics. We worked on, gosh, give me one sec.
Well, that's okay. I'm actually going to ask you in a moment about a couple ones in particular. So that's
Okay.
all cool. Talk to me about the writing process with your brother, especially because you're doing a collaborative effort and also you have potential for sibling rivalry there.
Yeah, people always, what is your writing process like with your brother? People always ask. For a long time, my brother used to joke that we would switch off word for word. It's a little easier than that. What happens with Scott and I is that we will, once we've got the story that's a task for us, once we know what we'll be writing, we'll sit down and break down the story. So we'll figure out, here's the 20 pages. How do you get the story to work out? What's going to be the high points of the story? Where are the dramatic parts of the story? And once we've got the 20-page breakdown, we, for each page, break down and block it out. One of the things that I think people don't always realize about comic books is that every page has to tell a story. And when you turn that page, each page has to have something going on that ends with that page, and then you go to the next page. And you almost have to have a sort of cliffhanger from page to page. If you don't have that, you don't have a reason to keep turning the pages. And unlike TV or movies, those page breaks in a comic book are really important. And so that's what the whole blocking out and figuring out the pages is really essential for it. And once we've got the 20 pages written, the 20-page breakdown written, then we go our separate ways, and we usually divide it in half. Once we've got the 20 pages, I'll see, okay, maybe I want to do this half, and Scott says, I'd rather do this half. We sometimes have to kind of flip for it. And we go off, we write those two halves separately, believe it or not. And then we come back together at the end of that, and we sort of reconcile the two halves and make sure it all fits together. You'd think that'd be a problem sometimes, and a couple of times we've had a few issues where so well, that's not what I was expecting. But usually what ends up happening is we end up sort of surprising each other with maybe some parts that we added, and that actually I think gives it a little bit more of a dynamic sort of angle to the story. Sometimes we don't always know exactly what's going to happen with the other one, and that gives the comics I think some unexpected turns, and I think that's a really good thing for both of us. So once we bring those two halves together and we reconcile them, then we've got our draft that we turn into our editors.
That's cool that you can surprise each other. I love that.
Yeah, it's really funny. You'd think that would be a bad thing, but there have been a couple of cases, especially on Next Gen Comics, where it actually provided something. You know, sometimes with Star Trek comics, it can be difficult because with something like Next Generation, where there are 7 years of stories, it can kind of be hard not to just do the same stories over and over. And so we often look for ways to think, okay, let's think of something that hasn't been done, and that angle of Scott and I trying to surprise ourselves is part of that, I think, sometimes.
Well, I have to ask because you worked on sort of franchise joinings, I guess is the way to describe it. Your projects for Doctor Who and also Planet of the Apes. Can you talk a bit about those?
Yeah. Doctor Who came first, and we sort of lucked out with Doctor Who. We got that task right when Doctor Who, especially the Matt Smith incarnation, was really exploding in the US. And there had been a number of pitches to try to do with Star Trek Doctor Who, and a lot of people were struggling with how to make that work. And Scott and I went round and round on it, and we figured out, okay, we got to take on it, a way to do it. And I think what's tricky about Star Trek Doctor Who is that Star Trek leans more towards science fiction, and Doctor Who leans more towards science fantasy. And what we thought was really important was trying to find some way to bring those two together and make them fit. And I think we pulled that off, although it's tricky at times. So that was, in a lot of ways, that was our most successful book. And I think that's part of the reason why, is I think we managed to find a way to bring those two together. Now, Star Trek Planet of the Apes is an interesting too, is that we knew that there had been a whole lot of pitches for Star Trek Planet of the Apes, and we knew that it had gone to a couple different iterations. We knew some people at IDW had tried to figure out a way to do it, and we knew some that it had been bounced around with 20th Century Fox too. And the problem always with crossovers is that if you do them, let me start that again. The difficulty with crossovers is it's easy to make them just kind of silly. And I'm not always the biggest fan of crossovers, but when I do them, I really insist upon, let's make them something that makes sense and not just for the sake of the crossover. And that's what I think a lot of people sort of agonize about is, oh, we don't like crossovers because they're kind of silly. But there's two reasons why crossovers happen. One reason why crossovers happen is because there's no way to do those in real life. So the only way you're going to see a crossover with Star Trek Doctor Who or Star Trek Planet of the Apes is if you see it in a comic book. And so that's why there's a lot of demand for it. It's like, this is the only way you're ever going to see that happen. And the other reason why crossovers are in such demand, why they do so well, is that even though sometimes people say, oh, we don't like crossovers, crossovers do really well. They do better than, say, just doing more of the same old, you know, if you say we've got a great new 5 issues of Star Trek, just like the old series, people are like, well, okay, we've seen that. So crossovers have that extra appeal that people think, hey, this is really interesting. How could we, what would it be like if you saw Star Trek Planet of the Apes? And so getting to the point of Star Trek Planet of the Apes is this was another one where it was very difficult to figure out to crack the story. And they had come to us and we had made, I think, an initial pitch, and it went into the hopper with all the others. And we know it went around and around, and no one could figure out a good story on it. And they came back to us again, which doesn't happen very often. And they said, well, you got another idea, another way to take it on? And so Scott and I had this long, oh, it must have been like a 2 or 3 hour meeting on the phone trying to figure out, okay, what's the way to make this work? And finally, we kind of stumbled on a way where I thought that if you could make it so that what happens in the second Planet of the Apes movie, and now I'm giving away a spoiler in a way, but if you can actually fit Star Trek into the Planet of the Apes scheme and into the Planet of the Apes movie story, so that what happens with the crossover explains the second Planet of the Apes movie, maybe there's a way to make that story work and make it kind of fun, so that when you get to the end of the story, you don't feel like, this was just a silly crossover with apes and Star Trek characters. If you actually made it think, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. Now we know what happened and why the second Planet of the Apes movie is the way it is. And so when we submitted that story, we got some interest, like, hey, maybe we're onto something. Let's see if we can develop that. So that's the way that came about. And the interesting thing about Star Trek Planet of the Apes is that our artist, this was the first big project for Rachel Scott, who's gone on to do lots of other great stuff, and she's fantastic. I think her art is an essential part of why that book did so well. I really love her work on that book.
I thought it was amazing as well, and absolutely loved it. So thank you for taking all the time to craft a really good story that worked. And I'm one of those who loves crossovers. Talk about Q conflict, plotting that out, because that was unbelievable in a good way.
Q conflict was tricky. One of the things that's tricky about, and to do what you asked, what about Q conflict? How did that come about? What started with Q conflict is IDW was looking for a new project that, IDW was looking for a new project that brought more than one enterprise together or more than one show together. So actually what they were looking for is, okay, can we do a crossover within Star Trek in some ways? And so they came to us and said, we've got an idea and we want to do a crossover of multiple crews over time. And I'm trying to remember if it was their idea to bring in Q or if it was our idea to bring in Q, but I always like working with Q. I think the Q character is fantastic. I like the way that he's portrayed. I think John Delancey is incredible in that role. And so we thought we could use Q to bind them all together. And funny thing about Q conflict is I think at the beginning, almost as a joke, we said, well, maybe it'll be something like Q will gather them all together and they'll pick out teams like dodgeball. And then as it turned out, that's what we ended up doing, is that they do pick teams under Q's guidance, and that's the way the story worked out. And that sort of fit into the kind of artificial things Q likes to do. And so it made sense in a way that seemed kind of jokingly at first, but it actually became an important story element that this is sort of Q's version of a Star Trek reality show. and I think that give us a way in to bring the different characters together from the different shows and make it more interesting that way too. And then as Q conflict went on, my favorite part of Q conflict is actually a little further in. I like the part later on where we see Q interacting with the wormhole aliens, and we see sort of the limits of Q's power there as well. And I really like the fact that the wormhole aliens can kind of put Q into his place. It's kind of an ugly scene there toward that latter part of the story where Q has clearly lost control, and what we see with the wormhole aliens is they are the ones who are sort of giving Q a piece of their mind.
And yeah, that was a fun scene for sure. So in your opinion, who was the last person picked for the dodgeball? You mentioned, they're pick and choose. Who do you think got picked last?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember. I think it might have been Quark.
I was testing you. You're absolutely right. Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was Quark.
Poor Quark. Poor.
Yeah, well, I think we even debated whether Quark should be there because he's not really a Starfleet member, and we had some difficulties about that.
What element of the Star Trek franchise have you not been able to tackle yet that you want to?
You know, the story we really haven't got a chance to do is Voyager. I really like Voyager. I know that a lot of sort of old-time Star Trek fans don't like Voyager as much. I do. I think the secret to sort of enjoying Voyager and appreciating it is you have to realize that Voyager is a show about a very flawed crew. And they are put in a number of difficult positions with difficult moral dilemmas, more so than even other captains and crews are. And because they are such a flawed crew, it's these Maquis and Federation guys all stuck together, that these combined crews are constantly wrestling with some of these issues. Now, here's another interesting part of that is some people complain about Voyager that, well, we didn't really see this dynamic between the Maquis and the Federation. We should have seen all the tension between them. But the fact is, if they did dwell on that, it had gotten really boring, I think. And I mean, how much do I really want to find out about how much Maquis guidelines don't mesh up with Starfleet guidelines? It sounds great, but I don't think there's really much to that. And I think where Voyager sort of excelled, especially later on, when you see episodes like Tuvix, where the captain is forced to use a transporter and separate Tuvix into Neelix and Tuvok, because she needs them both. And even though it involves essentially killing another character, this new Tuvix character, she does it. And there are a lot of other episodes like later on in Voyager where you see those tensions and the difficulty being out there in the Delta Quadrant. And I like Voyager a lot. And I wish we'd get a chance to do a story on Voyager.
You should do a sequel with the lizard kids and what they're doing.
Oh, I don't mind the episodes as much as some people do.
What is your favorite Star Trek series? And of that, what is your favorite episode?
My favorite series is probably Next Generation. I think I was of an age where I was really looking forward to a return to television of Star Trek. I love the movies, but oops. Are you still there?
I'm still here. I still see you.
Okay, something happened there. I'll start from
sorry. All right. Okay, cool. Thanks.
My favorite TV show, Star Trek Next Generation. I was of an age where I was really looking forward to a return to television of Star Trek. I love the movies. They were great. But I think I really wanted to see it back on television. I thought that individual issues were the way that you could best tell the kind of Star Trek stories I want, individual episodes, it's not comics, individual TV episodes were the way I wanted to see Star Trek. And I thought that was the best place where you could see the kind of stories I thought Star Trek was best suited to. And so when Star Trek Next Generation started, I was really happy about it. I even like most of the first season, I think, more than a lot of people do. I think there are definitely some real clunkers in the first season, but there are also some really great ones. And one of my favorites is actually in the first season of the episode Conspiracy, which I think it's just a great episode. It stands out. And I think what it does towards the end of the first season is it makes it clear that, hey, this show can work. You see this interesting story about these bluegill aliens that infest and take over the Federation. So for a change, we see the Federation can be vulnerable. It's not that Starfleet's not necessarily always on top of everything. And we also see all this great stuff about how the Federation works behind the scenes. There's also this fantastic scene where Picard goes to this mining planet and meets up with the other captains who are concerned about this conspiracy. It's one of the best scenes in Next Generation, but I think because of some of the other elements of Conspiracy that people kind of argue about, that it's not appreciated as much. So Conspiracy is definitely one of my favorites. I know it's easy to say, oh, I love Best of Both Worlds, or I love The Inner Light, but I like Conspiracy for different kinds of reasons.
Feast, relish in your body.
I love that scene in the mining plant. I think it's just great. It's really well directed. It's well shot. You see Patrick Stewart at some of his best in that scene, and the other captains there are great as well. I love that stuff.
Well, and it had such a shocking ending as well. You just don't expect that, especially in Star Trek. And it was,
Yeah, and at the time, I think that's kind of what made it a sort of controversial episode. I know that the show got very mixed reviews from fans about that because of that closing scene. But I think it's also one of those things where, had that been a few years later when sort of the perception or the thoughts about violence on television had changed, I don't think people would have been quite as worked up about that scene as they were in 1988 or whenever it was. But yeah, no, I like Conspiracy a lot.
it was the first episode of Star Trek TNG where I said, wow, this actually is going places I like.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what happened to me too.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. There's a funny story. I think it was one of my years in the dorms at university, and I had come back from being on campus, and I walked into the lobby in the dorm, and people were sitting around and they were watching Conspiracy, and I walked in basically on that scene. And the people watching the show, their mouths dropped wide open. And I thought, what's going on? What happened? And I hadn't seen the last few episodes because my brother had been taping for me at home. So I was looking forward very much to coming home and seeing that Star Trek. I wanted to see Conspiracy, but I remembered the reaction of people in that room like, wow, this can't be Star Trek. And it wasn't all bad. This is people like, this is something different. It's something new. And I think television was changing at that time. I think one of the things that goes unappreciated about Star Trek Next Generation is that it was part of this boom in late 80s dramas where dramas became more serious and more interesting and a little bit more episodic. You start to see the beginnings, what gets further developed in Star Trek Next Generation, of episodic story arcs. Conspiracy is clearly an episode that's starting to try to do that sort of thing. And I think there was some pushback about it. Later on, that became something that was okay. In other words, Conspiracy is sort of like the beginning of the Dominion War, except we didn't get it because people were too scared to do that kind of television yet.
I like that. Who are your two favorite Star Trek characters?
Who are your two favorite Star Trek characters? My first favorite is probably Data. I think it's a great character. I think he was played particularly well by Brent Spiner. I like Data because he's got a kind of childlike quality, but there's also a sort of old soul wisdom to him. He's not just naive. And in fact, there's a lot of times on the show where you're almost led to believe that Data is not quite as naive as he lets you think he is. I mean, the most famous example of that might be in The Most Toys, where at the end we're certainly led to believe that Data pulled the trigger on the phaser to stop Fazio and actually to kill him. And then afterwards, when they ask him about it, Data says, "Oh, it must have been a mistake. I'm sure that didn't happen." So Data is probably my favorite character. Second favorite character, probably also a Next Gen character, and it's oddly, I think he doesn't get mentioned as often, maybe as he should, but it's Riker. I think Riker, Jonathan Frakes was particularly inspired casting up against Patrick Stewart because Riker is so different from Patrick Stewart. He is very sort of loyal on one hand, he's very serious sometimes, but also he's goofy as heck sometimes too, and I like that also. And another thing I like about Riker is that he is so, for someone who can be so serious, he's also very easily exasperated. I don't think there's anyone on Star Trek who says, "What the hell," as often as Riker does. And I always get a kick out of it. And I think that's something that quality is something he carried into the movies as well that I always liked about Riker. I'll give you one other favorite character. Another favorite character of mine is Garak. Garak in Deep Space Nine is fantastic. Andrew Robertson is just great. It's a really powerful performance. what I like about Garrick is he's complicated. He is uh, devious, but not without a certain amount of soul and a certain amount of introspection to it as well. And you can see the gears turn in the face when you watch Andrew Robertson's performance as Garrick. It's just fantastic, and I always have appreciated the fact that, as it turns out, Garrick manages to save the Alpha Quadrant. He's the one who helps out Cisco when the Romans get involved in the war. It's an interesting character, and it's not, in a lot of ways, it's not a traditional Star Trek character, and that's why it's interesting to me.
My daughter wants to see a Project Runway hosted by Garrick.
He has the right kind of voice for that. The story we're working on right now is a Deep Space Nine story, and it's interesting because it's late in the Deep Space Nine run. It's season 6. It's right around that same time when Garrick has helped to save the Alpha Quadrant. And what's interesting to me about it is that we have someone come on the ship, and they sort of ask about Garrick, and they said they've heard things about him. And it's funny because at the beginning of the show, we're sort of led to believe that, oh, Garrick has disguised himself as a tailor. But by the end of the show, there can't be much doubt about who Garrick really is, because he's the only Cardassian left on the ship. And he's been involved in so many things over time that it's sort of odd that he's still going through this motions of pretending he's the tailor.
I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with Deep Space Nine for sure. And hopefully someday you guys will get to do a Voyager one as well.
Yeah, I really like Voyager. I'm hoping that something like that will come up too.
What do you see as the future of Star Trek?
It's interesting. When Discovery started and when Picard started, I liked to see the reaction on social media. And what I see is there's a lot of engagement with it, and there's a lot of interest. And the thing that sometimes people forget is that when Star Trek Next Generation started, a lot of people complained so bitterly about it. Oh, they hated it, couldn't stand it, they didn't like these characters. And, I see sort of the same thing happen with Picard and with Discovery too, is that sometimes new things at first, people are like, oh, geez, this isn't what I expected. And then as time goes on, those perceptions change. And I think we're seeing that already with these, that I'm seeing that kind of interest and engagement. And what's interesting to me about, and I think something I mentioned earlier, is that I think episodic Star Trek has a way of getting at certain sort of moral issues and interesting questions that sometimes the movies can't tackle. And so I think we'll see that with the television show versions in ways that you won't see it in some of the movies.
Just curiosity, because this is something I think about. Because Discovery and Picard are serialized, you have essentially one story over a whole season, as opposed to episodic, which was like Next Gen or Voyager. What do you think about that?
Sometimes I wonder if we're ever going to see a return to old type one-off episodic Star Trek. Discovery in the second season was a little bit closer in some ways to that. There were a few episodes that were kind of standalones. Picard was episodic pretty much throughout. I'd like to see more episodic, but television has changed. It's interesting, like we were talking about earlier. Star Trek Next Generation was that old model of standalone, one episode, one story, but that transition in television was something that Deep Space Nine in a lot of ways pioneered. And when you get to the later episodes of Deep Space Nine, it's very episodic. I mean, it's very, very much art oriented and not episodic anymore. I don't know if we're going to see a return to the one-off episodes like we used to. I also think it's a matter of the changes in television production. I also don't know if these days people could do 26 seasons of a TV show in the past. I'm not sure they can do it anymore. It's very difficult, and it's just not suited to the way television's produced these days.
Yeah, unless you're like NCIS or something like that.
Yeah, and that's about the only episodes, the only kind of places where you see that anymore.
Well, this is the essay portion of the of your exam, quote unquote. So Scott warned you.
Yes.
So if you wouldn't mind doing that for me, and I'll mute myself again, and then when you're done, count to 3 or 2 or 3, and then do the live long and prosper for me, if you wouldn't mind.
Let me see if I can make sure I can do it. I'm one of those people who has a hard time with it. I think I can do it with this hand. All right. 1, 2, 3. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before.
That was great.
I had mentioned the Harlan Ellison stuff.
Do you want to talk about that?
I think I got a couple stories, but they might be ones Scott already told, but I can tell you.
All right. Well, yeah, go for it. Talk about Harlan Ellison and Sitting on the Edge Forever.
So what happened with Sitting on the Edge of Forever is that Harlan wanted to have a comic version done of that for years. He, as most people know who know Harlan, he felt very unhappy with the way his screenplay turned out in the actual television episode. I would argue that his screenplay was actually improved. And I think as Harlan got older, and especially once he found out that the person who made the changes were actually DC Fontana, I think his anger kind of cooled a bit over it. But Scott, my brother, and Chris Rowell, and I had both come to know Harlan. And so it was great for us to be able to, I think, Harlan, we can actually do this and make the comic book version of it that actually tells your original story. And when we were able to work with J.K. Woodward, who Scott and I have worked with a lot, it was even better because J.K.'s art is so well suited to City Angel Forever. So it was a really nice combination of individuals. I'm really happy the way that worked out. We also all knew Harlan. We knew he could be difficult to work with. One of my favorite stories is that when we first started, Scott and I had finished the first issue. We turned it over to Chris, and then it went over to Harlan, and Harlan got a hold of it. And then he called up Chris, the editor, and complained bitterly that Scott and I had changed the screenplay. And in fact, we hadn't. We had gone out of our way to do it as identically as possible to what Harlan had put in his original teleplay. So Chris got Harlan on the phone and went through our version with him issue by issue, and Harlan said, all right, okay, yeah, you're right. And so he said, yeah, that's good. and we were able to sort of soothe his concerns about it. This was a long, difficult kind of project for Harlan. He really wanted to see the story told as he originally envisioned it. So it was great. And he said, all right, they got it. They're doing it the way we expected. That the way I wanted, that's better. So that was great. And the other thing that was always kind of funny is that when we first started, I'm trying to remember the exact number here, but I think the way it worked out is that we had a certain amount of issues for the story. I think it was 6. And I had to divide the story up, and it was written as a teleplay. And so a teleplay is written in acts. Especially 1960s teleplays had a very rigid sort of formula for the way stories were told. You have to have the teaser, commercial, act 1, act 2, and they all have a commercial break. And when I realized that the teleplay didn't break into the same number of breaks as the number of issues we had. I was like, oh, geez, here we are. We barely even got started. I'm sure I've already ticked off Harlan Ellison. He's going to hate the fact we're going to change those kind of things. And as it turned out, that was one thing he didn't care about. He thought that was fine. So it was great. But those are some of the challenges that come up sometimes in converting something like a teleplay to a comic book, is that there were a lot of times in the teleplay when Harlan would have someone communicate with a nod or an action. And you can't do that in a comic book. You can't show a nod. You can't have a word balloon that says nod. So there were things like that we had to sort of adjust, and we knew we had to find ways that Harlan would like that. And Harlan he was particular enough and cared enough that he wanted to have those kind of things done right. And so it was really satisfying to make those kind of improvements for the comic book version, so that it worked out as a comic book adaptation of the teleplay. And it was great. I mean, Scott and I had been reading Harlan's works for years. I remember coming back from college and bringing back to my brother some of Harlan's books and saying, hey, check this stuff out. So it was really a real pleasure for us to get to work with him on those.
And I have to say, I absolutely loved it, as I thought at first, why did you do this? But when I read it, I'm like, oh, I get it now. So thank you.
There's one other interesting thing about that. You'll often hear people who've read Harlan's teleplay complain that, oh, this isn't all that great, really, despite all this controversy about it. Harlan didn't really get the characters right. They say that Harlan didn't really get Spock right. He's got Spock as kind of emotional sometimes. He's got other characters not quite acting the way they are. But the problem is that people don't understand, when Harlan originally started writing that screenplay, it was when the very first season of Star Trek had just started. In fact, I think he might have started even before the show went on the air. So he was working on those early versions of the characters. And that's why in his teleplay, his Spock is more like the Spock from the pilot. It's more like the Spock from the Captain Pike episode, because Harlan was running off of those original character designs and that model for the characters. He was thinking about, okay, this is how Spock's supposed to act. And so when Harlan was first writing that story, he didn't know about the changes that would happen over the course of that first season. So, I mean, I always give Harlan a bit of a break there, that, okay, it's easy to say, oh, he didn't understand the characters, but in fact, the characters weren't developed yet. He was, and one thing about Harlan is sometimes he would be slow to write something, as people would complain about. And so it took him a while to finish that screenplay. And by the time that teleplay was ready, the characters had changed a bit over the course of that first season.
Yeah, and the some of the earlier episodes also, Spock's a bit of a yeller,
Yeah,
full intensity.
right. And if you look at Harlan's teleplay, he has Spock like that. So in Harlan's mind, he's thinking, hey, I got Spock right.
All right, so all right, well, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it. Let me stop us here.